This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Welcome back to the Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast with your host, David Charlton. So, today's episode is a special one. The podcast has been running for 2 years, and I've produced an episode, sometimes 2 episodes, on a weekly basis, which has been a tough old slog, but something that I've been very passionate about following through with. And today, as I say, it's a landmark episode. I've got 2 very special guests on the show. So Doug Strycharczyk and John Perry are part of the mental toughness world. They're seen as big pioneers around mental toughness, and they've been co-authors with the 3rd edition of the book Developing Mental Toughness. And today we're going to dig into this topic. We're going to talk about the book, the new developments in the field. We talk about mental toughness and mental health, mental toughness and innovation, and mental toughness and trust too. It's a really enjoyable episode. I hope you get a lot from it. Hi Doug, John, it's fantastic to have you back on the show. And I'm wondering if the first question we can explore is the new book. So since the last time we spoke, I believe you've got a 3rd edition of Developing Mental Toughness out there now. Would you like to explain to the listeners about the new developments? You know, what has changed in the mental toughness world?
Well, that's great, and it's great to be back here, David. But of course, the biggest change is we have a 3rd author, and that's John, of course. The first 2 were Peter and I. So that's one of the big enhancements, of course. But I love that question, because one of the things that we've noticed is that the book is now selling as well as the 1st and 2nd editions ever were. So that's, we were wondering whether a 3rd edition would actually make an impact. It appears to be doing so. But the 3rd edition is really addressing the development of the 8-factor version of the 4 Cs mental toughness framework. And that's the first thing. It's addressing some of the questions that practitioners have been asking, especially around commitment. Originally, we saw commitment as 1 factor, but people began to come to us and say, I've assessed this person for commitment. They've got a moderately high score for commitments, but they don't deliver. Why? This doesn't seem to be picking it up. And that was what provoked us into thinking, well, maybe commitment's got 2 factors. There's the idea of goal orientation, or I have a purpose, and the idea of achievement orientation. So the research helped us to understand that. That's now embodied into the model. And the other one was challenge. And challenge was really about, we could understand that challenge, from the Cabasa theories, was about stretching yourself, pushing yourself, being prepared to be vulnerable in modern language. But what we also noticed was that lots of people would push themselves, it wouldn't work, and they would go back into their shell. And that wasn't quite consistent with the way we understood the notion of challenge. But then we broke that down and realized that some people push themselves and learn from it. Other people push themselves but don't learn from what happens. So we understood that there were 2 factors there. So that's really important. But the development of the 8 factors is the start, I think, of the next stage of the journey, because that level of granularity has enabled us to look at a lot of issues from a fresh perspective. So we're using the 8 factors as a way of looking at things that matter to a lot of people. So this year we've been looking at trust. A lot of people look at trust from the perspective of, David, I don't know that I can trust you. And the onus is on, is David trustworthy? Well, the starting point is, am I able to trust anybody? It's my mental approach to David and to the issue of trust that matters. If I haven't got the sort of courage to trust you, and I haven't got this self-belief in my abilities to deal with whatever emerges from trusting you, then maybe I just won't trust you. So the 8-factor framework for mental toughness has almost, it's like it's brought a lens to understanding how other people tick. And it's opening up a hell of a lot of new fronts. So we've been looking at things like trust, innovation, curiosity, and more recently, vulnerability. And the great thing about it is it really does help us to firstly explore those topics, and secondly, to identify some of the gaps in some of those concepts. So, the book has been kind of a staging post on that journey. It captured what we've learned, but now it's provoking a hell of a lot of new thinking that is really valuable to practitioners.
Brilliant, right? Exciting times ahead then, by the sounds of it. Where do we go with this? John, would you like to just explain to the listeners a little bit more about the commitment side and goal orientation, achievement orientation?
Yeah, absolutely. So where it emerged from, essentially, as Doug was alluding to there, is we almost tried to have this blend between research and practice. Now, it was practitioners recognizing that sometimes they weren't able to dig deep enough into the commitment score that people were getting on the MTQ-48, and that's what led us towards going away and trying to develop it. And to get to this point of being able to have really good psychometric properties for this 8-factor model, it's 7 years of work now has gone into adding that extra nuance, and that's what it is. It's nuance. It's understanding complicated people by having a model that allows us to recognize that those nuances. So you mentioned commitment there. It's a good example where previously we saw commitment largely as stickability, grit, determination, the extent to which you'll stick at a task until it's complete. But actually what we have now is that essentially describes achievement orientation, which is part of our commitment factor. The other part we have is goal orientation. And the distinction here is that these are independent but related factors, right? Goal orientation is the extent to which you say yes or likely to say yes to things. Are you motivated by targets? Are you motivated by goals? Whereas achievement orientation is the extent to which you make sure that you stick at something to meet that target or goal. And straight away, I think everybody listening to this can think of either themselves or other people. We all know of somebody who has high goal orientation. That person who says, yep, I'll do that. I'd love to do that. Bring it on. Absolutely. And they feel motivated by an idea, by a target, but they don't necessarily follow through. So they'd have lower achievement orientation. Or perhaps the opposite. The person who actually finds it quite anxiety inducing to be set goals and targets, but they're a good foot soldier. They're very good at following through on what they do. And by understanding a little bit more of the intricacies about how those factors interplay with each other, we might be able to help someone to develop a little bit further in a much more targeted fashion rather than this kind of broader approach. So I'm really pleased now that we kind of have this model that has an overarching view of someone's mental toughness. But from a practitioner point of view, what do you do with that? You're a 6 out of 10 on mental toughness. Okay, well, I need a bit more detail to go on before I can start actually working through some of the possible development opportunities there. So we can break it down to much more granular levels.
In terms of the development angle, as you say there, as a practitioner or as a coach, if a person completed goal orientation and they scored let's say a 9, so they love setting goals, yet their achievement orientation is a 4 for argument's sake, would the practitioner's role would be, I suppose, to break down the whole goal setting process so that it can be more effective?
It could well be. I suppose one thing that I would always suggest to a practitioner, though, is, and that's what this allows us the opportunity to do, think about the interaction between them. What I'm really interested in, and something that we need to do a little bit more research on, is the overall profile. So I wonder, right, is it better to have a 6 and a 6 on those 2 factors? Or is it better to have a 9 and a 4? The 9 and the 4 cumulatively is higher than the 6 and the 6. But that's a balanced profile. And I'm intrigued as a researcher. I wonder what the impact of that is. Because we could say, well, the person with the high score for goal orientation and the low for achievement orientation, on one hand, as a practitioner, I think, great, I can just build up their achievement orientation. Are there things I can put in place to help their concentration, attentional focus techniques to be able to stay on task, use controlled distraction so they can get back to the task more easily and build that up. And that might well work. Or maybe my aim is to say that could create conflict because they've taken on lots of stuff, but they're not following through, and that creates more stress, perhaps feelings of guilt and all those kind of things. So maybe actually I want them to meet in the middle, and I want them to sometimes reduce some of the things they're taking on, be motivated more by the completing the work and the actual process of the work, and less motivated by the outcome of it. And they're conversations that I think allows the practitioner to have with their client, and then mutually kind of identify the best way forward.
Yeah, I can imagine as well if they're high in risk orientation, then that causes another challenge there where they take on too much and take too many unnecessary risks.
David, there's if I come back to the granularity, to the 8 factors, they also bring a very useful dimension, because you've used a very good example there of having high goal orientation and low achievement orientation. So I have purpose. I know what I want to do, but I'm not doing it. But you can actually look at the interplay with all the other factors. You can look at confidence and abilities. It's the reason why you're not doing it because you're not confident in your own abilities. The reason why you're not doing it because you actually need to talk to other people and get them on board, and your interpersonal confidence isn't strong enough. Is the reason why you're not doing it because you're feeling very stressed and you can't manage your emotions, your emotional control. And so what we're beginning to get is something that's not just, two associated factors interplaying with each other. We're beginning to see how all the factors interplay with each other. And again, we keep saying that's really why the concept and the framework is valuable, but so is the mental toughness questionnaire, because it's really hard to get a fix on all 8 factors through a conversation. A trained psychologist could take a couple of days to get to the kind of information you can get in 20 minutes. So that brings a very, very useful dimension to the picture.
Yeah, it certainly highlights the power of the questionnaire, as you say. So, Doug, do you want to explain a little bit more about challenge and, the risk orientation, learning orientation, and how that's moved forwards?
Well, again, as John's just said, that came from practitioners, and particularly practitioners working with senior leaders. And what you'd often find is senior leaders would take a consultant on board, and they would really be looking for a new idea or the way to develop their strategy and move on. And you'd go and present an idea to a board or a senior leadership group. And it was surprising how often they would say, we've tried that and it didn't work. And you say, well, why didn't it work? It doesn't matter about that. We're not doing it again. And you think, well, just a minute. You've spent a lot of time, a lot of money doing something. What have you learned from that? No, we're not doing it again. We want you to come up with something new. We want you to come up with, a magic bullet. And an awful lot of people, they're open to those things. They're quite happy to try a new idea or, explore something that's they've never touched before. But these are all experiences. And what we found is they weren't prepared to reflect. And if they weren't prepared to reflect, they weren't learning from what had happened before. That wasn't true of all groups. What we did find was some people would say, what do you mean? We should look at what we just tried. And then you'd go through the process with them and say, well, what worked? What didn't work? What can you put right? What didn't work? What about trying it again? And so we began to understand that there was this difference, and it was this learning orientation aspect that, again, was, where challenge was almost entirely about risk orientation before, there was a learning orientation element. What's the point of trying something new? You're not going to learn from it. More generally, you wander through life and you're constantly coming up against new situations. So if you're not reflective, you stand a very high chance of repeating mistakes, not making as much progress as you want. And so, that's where our exploration of the challenge construct came from.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in there as well, I know you have a sporty audience for the podcast as well. So I've found that change to be so useful when I'm consulting with athletes. In that, anecdotally, I don't know what others working in sport might have come across, but I found on average much lower levels of learning orientation in elite athletes than I'd expect. Often I see this huge gulf between their high risk orientation, low learning orientation, to the point where I'm thinking that has to be something culturally that we're building into the development of young athletes, because I'm seeing it so regularly. And I just think, okay, are we good at encouraging them to go and express yourself and take risks and live in the moment and all that kind of thing, but less good at developing that reflective practice part as well? And it's the change to the model that's kind of allowing me to unpick that and have some good conversations, and also good conversations with the coaches as well, once coaches understand that their athletes are perhaps missing opportunities for learning.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I've found exactly the same with my work, where I don't know whether it's a cultural thing in sport. Obviously, if you're out there training, you're out playing matches and things like that, the busy people, aren't they? And they want to be, I suppose, doing their craft. And is it just so natural to them to actually sit back and take stock and reflect? I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, anyone that's been in a high performance sports setting, you've probably sat in the room when the video analysis of a previous game is taking place and players are there. It's normally after training, and you just get a real vibe from them that they want to get away. They've kind of enough, and there is that sense, and you see the poor performance analysts trying their best to be really engaging and everything, and trying to keep them entertained and engaged in it. And perhaps also on average, people performing at an elite level in sport are much younger than people performing at an elite level in other areas of life most of the time. And in terms of our development, the capacity to be able to reflect, it does come later. I think it's incredibly difficult to ask a 22-year-old to be really reflective. But you know what? Working in sport, a lot of it is essentially about trying to speed up that psychological maturation, I find. The amount of times you can sit with a footballer who's aged 33 who says, if I could have a superpower, it would be to put my mindset now into my 18-year-old self. Because the way that you're able to manage situations and think about things, unfortunately, the way sport works is normally about the same time that your body's giving up. It's just about the time your brain's developing that kind of capacity. So I think in those situations, the job is almost to try and speed up that psychological development to hang on to the coattails of the physiological development that's happening.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That does, John. Let's have a look at one of these other areas that you've touched on earlier, Doug. Innovation. So why does mental toughness influence the ability to innovate?
Well, innovation is closely linked to creativity. It's slightly different in that creativity is about being prepared to explore new ideas. So there's an obvious link to challenge and risk orientation, stretching yourself, and a very obvious link to learning orientation. But it also links to things like confidence and abilities. Now, a lot of us have got a lot of abilities. We've learned how to do things, but if we don't believe in ourselves, we don't use those abilities. So we don't innovate, or we're not creative. The difference between innovation and creativity, though, is that innovation is creativity with a purpose. You're usually trying to be creative for a reason, and that reason is usually to try and improve something or come up with something new. So innovation in business is really big. It's one of the sort of big developments at the moment, and it's coming out with with all sorts of language coming out around it, design thinking and so on. But what makes innovation special is that element of focus, and that probably relates to the commitment factors we've been talking about earlier. Goal orientation. Something's happened. I want to find a better way of doing it. That is about setting a goal and having a purpose. With creativity, you don't necessarily need to have that purpose. Creativity, you just want to kind of do something, see what's out there, or exercise the mind and see if you can come up with something new. You won't necessarily be focused on anything. But with innovation, you are very clearly focused on, I need to do something better, and I need to find a better way of doing things. And so that's going to be one element of it. And of course, if you're genuinely innovative, you're productive, then you would have to have a degree of achievement orientation as well. Otherwise, all you're doing is, as we've discussed before, you've got the idea, you know what you should be doing, but you don't make the effort. So one of the things we've been doing, David, is looking at, this is an example of how we use the framework as a lens to look at issues that are relevant for a lot of people. And what we've been doing is using exactly the same lens to look at trust, innovation, leadership, team working. And the great thing about that is you're using the same framework to link a lot of the ideas and things out there that matter to a lot of people, but you're doing it through a common lens. So you've got the opportunity to link all of those ideas. Whereas in practice, when you see consultants and practitioners at work, they very often treat all of these as individual things, quite separate things, and they don't connect them. So I think the mental toughness concept and framework is beginning to give us something really, really valuable. It's beginning to give us that ability to see everything in a joined up way. And I think that's, in 10, 15 years' time, when we've kind of really thought our way through that, I think that's where we'll be making a big difference around the world.
I imagine emotional control will come into play as well. That was some of the other factors too.
Absolutely. And what we're learning is every one of the factors has potentially a role to play in everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff, that is. And then we've got trust as well, which you've obviously touched on. Do you want to share a little bit more about that, John?
Yeah. So Doug gave a nice example earlier in terms of, and for the record, of course, I would trust you, David. But yeah, what we want to do, right? We're all interested in how an individual can develop, and as Doug was alluding to earlier, sometimes the lack of trust that somebody feels and demonstrates is just as much of a reflection on themselves. And well, why? If you naturally feel that other people have to earn your trust, what does that point to? There's a caution there. Is that because you're concerned of your capacity to deal with the potential consequences if that trust gets broken, or if you get exploited in some kind of way? So again, you could pretty much pick out any factor from the mental toughness framework that you like to explore that. Is it a sense of life control and being able to be in a position where you're prepared to give up some control to someone else and not feel that you need to be in touch, which in a strange way, in a sort of paradoxical way, is quite high life control, being prepared to give some of that control away because you feel that you'll be able to manage the fallout from it. Is it a confidence issue? Is it an emotional control issue? Is it because you're concerned about your ability to learn from those kind of processes? If you have that kind of stability, security, willingness to learn, are you therefore more likely to say, okay, I can trust you because even if you let me down, I'll be okay. I'll learn. And then I'll go forward and I'll trust the next person. Whereas if you're more sensitive to situations, to context, to experiences, then if I trust you and you let me down, then my future cognitive processes, emotional reasoning is in a way dictated by those contextual experiences, which means I might put my guard up and I'll be less likely to trust you in the future. Now, where we are at the moment with this is at a more hypothetical stage, but as what Doug was alluding to, we're able to test these things. So because we have a really good kind of psychometrically sound framework for our mental toughness framework, we're able to test those associations. So we don't just have to talk about them, but we can have those ideas, generate them, hypothesize, test, and then we can speak about things from an evidence-informed viewpoint, which is fantastic.
I could add something else in there because, what the framework is allowing us to do is also to allow us to look at some of these ideas from several perspectives. So John's just described my mental approach getting in the way of trusting other people. But you can also use it as a mirror. You can look at yourself and say, okay, if I'm looking at my mental toughness, my mental approach to events, what is it about my mental toughness that would encourage somebody else to trust me? And if trust is a two-way thing, it's not necessarily you, it's me. So I can use that. An obvious factor would be achievement orientation. That should reflect somebody who's consistent, who keeps promises. That is likely to be a marker for trust for other people. So you can look at yourself and say, right, high life control. I tend to have a high can-do approach. People probably are like that. They'll probably trust me if I do that. So you can look at the same issue from several different angles using the same framework. So instead of getting a one-dimensional view on things, you can get a multi-dimensional view on things.
Yeah, so I suppose it works the other way as well, doesn't it? Where you say there about a high life control, you having that can-do attitude can also put people off if they're actually lower on that aspect.
Yes.
Fascinating. Okay, so the last bit I'd like to unpick would be mental health. Obviously, it's a topic which seems to be in the news and in the media on a daily basis. So, yeah, can you just talk about the differences and how mental toughness can help us understand our mental health?
Yeah, you're right. It is regularly spoken about, and for a good reason, because mental health is, of course, one of the most burning issues around. What I sometimes come up against, and this often confuses me, right, is people kind of seeing mental toughness as being in opposition to mental health. And I get this from the sport world, and I know that Doug never comes across it outside of sport. I think it comes from this misconceptualization of mental toughness, that mental toughness is somehow all about doing everything to win, and if that means sacrifice of everything, that's what you do to win. And these really outdated misconceptualizations of what being tough is in a sporting context in order to succeed. Whereas mental toughness derives from health psychology. That's where its roots are. The hardiness model from Susan Kobasa is a health psychology model. And our model has come from that. So empirical research shows us that mental toughness is positively associated with positive mental well-being. It's negatively associated with burnout. It's negatively associated with anxiety. It's negatively associated with depressive symptoms. Every piece of empirical data we have shows that mental toughness is positively related with positive mental health. So sometimes I think we almost talk about mental health and performance as in some way being almost on a continuum, like being high in one would be low in the other. And I've never understood that. In sport, people sometimes say, oh, what's more important, enjoyment or winning? And I'm always confused by that because I really enjoy winning. I can't help but think the two can be high. And so I think back to there's a Keys conceptualization of mental health where they were looking at ill health and mental health as being these kind of independent factors where you can have high levels of mental health and you can also have mental ill health. And again, working professional sport, some people are performing really well and they're flourishing, they're doing well, but they're still managing, some kind of body dysmorphia, eating disorder, depressive symptoms, those kind of things. You can still perform well and be well, but have mental ill health. Equally, you can you can perform well and not be well. The things are not necessarily kind of two ends of the same continuum. And I think what we know with mental toughness is that it's positively associated with both. And I would never kind of seek to work with an individual saying, okay, let's concentrate on your performance or let's concentrate on your mental health. I can't help but feel what I want to do is I want all round that person to flourish. I want them to have as much positive mental health as possible, and I want them to perform as much as they can. And that doesn't mean softly, don't worry, it's okay to make mistakes, because I want to push them and I want to stretch them. But I think we need that more mature understanding of the complexities of it. Yeah, I go on a bit of a rant about that topic sometimes.
Have you got anything to add on that one, Doug?
Well, I think, yes, I think John makes a really, really good point. And the thing that's sometimes people lose sight of is that they talk about mental toughness and mental sensitivity as if it's you're all or one thing or the other. Actually, in reality, if you look at those 8 factors, we are very often 2 or 3 areas of mental sensitivity and 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 areas of mental toughness, or some different blend. So we all have areas of mental sensitivity. And what we're beginning to look at a little bit more closely is what is the impact of that mental sensitivity that sits within most of us that impacts on our mental health or our well-being. And I think that's the thing that's, I'm looking forward to exploring further in the future and developing more and more solutions. But at the heart of it, it's about self-awareness. And I think it's something we've spoken about before. None of this can work unless we're self-aware about our mental toughness, about those 8 factors.
You just got in there. That's exactly what I was going to say there.
Sorry.
is the key in all this. So, right, as we begin to wrap up, normally I would ask for 3 takeaways, but because there's the 2 of you, we'll do it a bit different. Yeah. Doug, do you want to share one key takeaway that the listeners can take away from this conversation, and then John can do the same?
Well, for me, it's getting under the skin of the 8 factors. Ever since we published the book, that was kind of one moment. We kind of said, we've got 8 factors. We understand to a large extent what they are. Now we're beginning to explore what those 8 factors mean for a whole host of things, for a whole host of people in just about every domain you can think of. And for me, that's exciting. But apart from exciting me and making me feel great, I think we have the potential for developing some really interesting solutions for a lot of people there.
And mine would be, it's not quite the same, but it is very close. The phrase I always use is that people are complicated, right? And I'm always a little bit frustrated in the aim of putting research into practice. We sometimes see this oversimplification of something that should be really complicated, and we're presented with a simple model. What we have here is, I believe, an accessible model, and we put a lot of effort into trying to help people understand the model. But it is sufficiently complex that it represents people, because people are really, really complex. I've never met a simple one, which is always interesting, because I've met a few where you think they're simple at first, but actually once you get beneath the skin, you start to realize they're not. And that's what this continuing development we have of adding more nuance to the model allows us to examine.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you for both your takeaways and your insights. I've loved the conversation. I'm sure the listeners will get an awful lot out of it, as usual. In terms of, if the listeners want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me either through AQR International, and that's www.aqrinternational.co.uk, or through LinkedIn. I encourage people to connect with us on LinkedIn. We put a lot of stuff out on LinkedIn, or my email address, which is also on LinkedIn.
And so University of Limerick is where I'm based, in the Department of Physical Education and Sports Science, so you can find me there. You probably can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not the most active, but I'm a snooper in the background, so I do pick up messages. Or you can get me on Twitter. I'm always Delighted to add to my small smattering of followers. So I'm at John Perry 81 on Twitter if you wanted to get me there.
Excellent. I'll pop all those details in the show notes, and yeah, hopefully you'll get some people reaching out. Many thanks for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you to you, David. Yeah. We've enjoyed it too.
As always, great to chat, David.
Thanks, John. Well, that was a really enjoyable episode to record. And as Doug and John have given one takeaway, I thought I would share another takeaway to round it up to the three, as we normally do on this podcast. So my takeaway really is it's linked to the podcast as a whole. As I've mentioned, this is a landmark episode. We're 2 years in now. And what I wanted to do with the podcast was demystify mental toughness. So it says what it does on the tin. And my key takeaway here is, mental toughness, you can be a caring individual and be mentally tough even. Mental toughness is not just a male macho trait. There's many women out there who are mentally tough, as you'll have recognized from some of the different episodes that we've covered. Then mental toughness is not just a sporting term. It's used in health. In fact, it was grounded in health psychology. And then it overlaps into the business, the workplace too. And there's huge relationships there, as Doug and John have alluded to, with trust, with innovation, with mental health. Arguably, according to the research, mental toughness accounts for up to 25% variation in performance, as well as having a big impact on optimal well-being and functioning. So, yeah, I hope this podcast has answered a few more questions for you and given you more awareness of mental toughness and what it's all about. Moving forward to the next 12 months, the next 2 years, I'd love it if you could message me, send me an email and give me some ideas on how I can take the show to the next level. Some tips would be really, really helpful. You can also join the Sports Psychology Hub, where we've got over 1,500 members. And you could just send me a message on there too. Or you can just join the group so you can see what it's all about and learn from other people as well. Have a fantastic week ahead. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.